Okay, so I want to start off by talking about the idea of deviance. So first of all, just to be very clear about what I mean by this term, I'm not using this synonymously with crime. Instead, I mean it kind of in the ways that you usually would think about it, or that normal people would usually think about it. Not, academics aren't really normal, but like, connotations of weirdo, freak, asshole. Like those are various forms of deviance. Typically, what we kind of include in this set of category, or in this category of behaviors, is it's something that's atypical, it's out of the norm, it's not normal, abnormal, and it's usually deemed to be problematic. So it's either considered immoral or harmful, or just bad in some way. But I want to make clear that it's not necessarily objectively harmful. It's not necessarily, like, it's hard to be objective about morality, but it's not something that's objectively bad, but it's something that people believe is bad for whatever reason. So it's not necessarily illegal, immoral, harmful, and so on. I also want to kind of clarify this general type of deviance from other forms of deviance that people have used in the literature, including things like elite deviance or positive deviance. Innovation, kind of by definition, is in some form deviance because it's kind of atypical, but it's a lot of times seen as a good thing. Like we have schools of innovation, centers for innovation, innovation grants, and so on. So I'm very specifically talking about what we might think of as negative deviance, but usually that we just call deviance. Okay. The other thing I want to emphasize about deviance is that it's something that is not, again, it's not objective, but it's socially constructed. There's a process by which people decide that something is considered deviant or not. So this is some underlying process. And for this, I'm going back to Howie Becker's work in his book on labeling theory, where he explains that deviance is the product of a process which involves responses of other people to the behavior. So it's a kind of a dynamic model rather than a static thing of you are a deviant, you always will be a deviant, and so on. But it's something that can be kind of contingent depending on the social context, the settings, and especially to whom you're talking. Okay. Another piece of deviance that I want to clarify is kind of consistent with this idea of social context matters, that it's a fluid or contingent category, is it's going to vary depending on kind of from perspective. So you can always have deviance and kind of normals or conformists, and then you can switch those. And so this is another quote from Becker, where he says, social groups create deviance by making the rules whose infraction constitutes deviance, and by applying those rules to particular people and labeling them as outsiders. But here's the important part: the rule breaker may feel his judges are the outsiders. So basically, insiders can think the outsiders are deviants, but those outsiders can be insiders in another group and think the original insiders are actually the outsiders. Okay. And then this is from South Park. They made a joke at one point in one of the episodes, like, basically if you want to be a nonconformist, you have to conform to the way that we do things. So again, this insider-outsider thing. Every social group has its norms, and therefore every social group has some form of deviance. Okay, so the kind of problem, though, is that people have kind of, I don't want to say stopped because that's too official, but basically people stopped studying deviance. It was really popular to study in like the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. It apparently peaked in the 70s, but since then it's really gone away. People still use the term like crime and deviance, or all these textbooks about deviance, which are really just criminology theories about like why people commit crime, and so that's a little problematic. But just to kind of show you a couple of indications, so this is a Google Ngram. You can very easily run these on Google. They're not supposed to be like the most rigorous level of data collection, but it's just kind of meant to be an illustration of, from my read, this seems to be fairly consistent with what's happened in the literature. So it was kind of really popular mid-century, and then it's kind of declined since then. So this is a representation over time, kind of starting in 1800, of all uses of the terms deviant and deviance. And so then the y-axis is like the frequency, and so they came back down basically around as we get into the 80s, and just kind of stayed stable over time. Just to give you another sense, because this is the frequency of these words in all books that have been scanned by Google. So just to get a sense of some other things, I've added in the term social control, which beginning around the close to 1970s is pretty similar in terms of its use. So oftentimes we use deviance and social control together. And so this gives you another sense of kind of what's happening. It kind of went up around the 60s and then kind of leveled off as we get into the 80s. I just wanted to throw in like how much of this is because of disciplinary differences. Again, kind of not making any super rigorous claims, but kind of just for comparison, we can see criminology kind of goes up a little bit in this period, but not so much, and then it keeps going up. So, that's an interesting trend. But what's really going on, or what I think is really going on here, is people within the field of sociology are not talking about deviance anymore. So in mid-century, sociology was really like the place to study deviance. Criminology as a separate field hadn't really emerged. Like that's really in the 1970s where criminology splits off. But you see these peaks with sociology, deviance, social control, and deviant that you don't see with criminology. So I think it really peaked within sociology, and the drop-off is really coming from sociology. And in fact, if you look at other disciplines, you don't see a similar peak in terms of their overall use. So I really think there's something going on with sociology, and that's fairly consistent with like impressionistic considerations. Okay, so one question I've been thinking about and that I've been talking with various colleagues about is basically why do people stop studying deviance? Like why is this no longer a popular thing? It used to be in the like mid 50s, 60s, the top sociologists in the US context especially were talking about deviance and coming up with these theories of deviance. And then it just kind of went away. And so I think there are four big reasons for that. One is in the 1950s, I think there was a lot more low-hanging fruit, and our standards for theory are much higher these days. And the problem is that theories around deviance aren't very good. So putting aside questions about like what explains deviant behavior, which I tend to think is kind of a normatively and empirically problematic theory, as other people have pointed out before. In terms of this question of like why is certain behavior considered deviant or not deviant, and how does that change over time, we don't have a lot of good theory about that. Like even Becker, that I started off with, where he talks about there's this process, this dynamic process by which some behavior gets labeled deviant and others not. That's in his first chapter of his book, Outsiders, and then basically the rest of the book is explaining why people do deviant things. So he sets up this great sociological analysis saying that this isn't an objective category, and then basically trashes that and then tries to explain deviance, basically read criminality or bad behavior and stuff. So we don't have really good theory to explain this social construction of deviance. Another problem with it is kind of a set of normative considerations. Normative, empirical, but I think normative problems are the biggest one, which is in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s when deviance was having its heyday, people were including in the category of deviance not just things like crime, but also other types of difference that we today wouldn't say is deviant behavior or problematic or bad or immoral or anything like that. So specifically, they would talk about things like same-sex relations or drug use, and these are things that today we have very different views about, and also like science has changed some of those original problematic views. So just to give you an example, again, this is coming from Becker, where he explains some deviants, parentheses, homosexuals and drug addicts are good examples, develop full-blown ideologies explaining why they are right and why those who disapprove of and punish them are wrong. And this is like an excerpt from my notes on his book, just like, so there's a lot of that. So when you say you want to study deviance, sometimes people think you're like one of those people who has really outdated problematic views about reality. A third factor that I think is possibly an explanation, although my engrams maybe kind of cast some doubt on this, is the rise of criminology as a distinct disciplinary field, especially in American academic context. This varies a little bit from country to country, but focusing mostly on the US context, criminology basically splits off from sociology around the 1970s. It's kind of an ongoing process going back from about the 1910s when you get the first criminology department, but it really takes off in the 1970s and you get this massive split. As a consequence, there's been this kind of parceling out of who should study what, and so basically anything relating to crime and punishment increasingly has been shoved off to criminology and is increasingly seen as something that's like not befitting sociologists. And we've had an interesting debate about this on Twitter and some blog posts recently about this kind of why people do this. But for now, I just want to kind of put that out there as one of the things that I think might be explaining why people aren't studying deviance anymore. Finally, within sociology, there's been a big shift in interests. So in the 1950s, 60s, a little bit in the 70s, there was a lot of interest in norms, normality and conformity, and like that was a big focus. But I think if you were to ask people within sociology what the primary kind of set of interests are today, I think that would be replaced by things like power, hierarchies and especially stratification, essentially inequality of various kinds. And whether one uses power or inequality, I think basically you're talking about the same set of issues, and that's become kind of like the big thing that these days sociologists, like by and large, are mostly interested in a way that norms used to be the primary interest. What's interesting about this to me is this doesn't seem like an easy explanation for why deviance went away, because there's so many parallels that we can make between like social hierarchies and how certain things become rendered seen as deviant, and so on. But I think there's that ongoing history where things where people who had low status or at the bottom of the social hierarchy get rendered deviant, and then all those theories trying to explain that behavior rather than trying to explain the processes that make that happen. I think people are kind of remembering that rather than looking at the potential of how we can involve power hierarchies and so on to explain this construction of deviance. So these are the big four reasons that I think are going on. I'd be curious if you guys have other ideas about why deviance has kind of gone away. But I think these are the four primary ones. Okay, so one of my kind of lifetime goals is to try to bring back the study of deviance, because I just think it's really interesting, and I think there's a lot of stuff we could do with it. But I think one of the biggest problems facing kind of reviving the field of deviance studies is just the lack of really good theory. And so for that, because I don't claim to be like a particularly good theorist who can come up with new theories, I'm borrowing from my favorite set of theoretical frameworks and theories, neo-institutional theory, which is actually an organizational theory. But as I'll explain in a moment, I'm going to apply this outside of the organizational context. But just to give you kind of some background in neo-institutional theory, again within this organizational field of like sociology, increasingly in business schools and other areas, this is a set of scholars who are looking at organizational behavior not as rational behavior, which is like the classic early organizational theory view, and it's also one that like business schools a lot of times still hold to. So not organizations as behaving as rational actors, basically doing the most efficient and effective thing, but looking at the process by which whatever is seen as rational, efficient, effective, and so on, like what's the process of making that thing become seemingly rational, and especially focusing on issues like legitimacy. Just to back up for a moment, one of the big things that people in neo-institutional theory have done that kind of really made them a useful theory within organizational theory is moving from the study of individual organizations to the study of an organizational field. And this is a key concept that I'm going to return to, so just to make clear what I'm talking about, an organizational field is basically all of the relevant organizations as well, so it's like the focal organization, so if you're studying prisons, it's all prisons, as well as their regulators, their funders, their clients, and so on. So it would be things like for prisons, then you'd have correctional bureaucracies, you'd have the legislatures, you would have like non-government organizations that are like, you know, reform and activist groups, you would have the media, you'd have all these different groups that have some sort of impact in kind of changing how we think about prisons or punishment and so on. Okay. The other thing that they do in kind of looking at this field is they look at how organizational behavior is really shaped by norms and expectations about how organizations should behave, which neo-institutional theorists argue basically takes place at the field level. So it's in the interactions between these different types of organizations, their funders, regulators, and so on, that we kind of come to this consensus within a particular field about what constitutes the right, the efficient, the moral, the effective way of doing something. Okay. And ultimately, organizational behavior, they explain, is we expect them to essentially conform to these expectations or to these ideas about what constitutes the right way to do things. Because if they don't, ultimately that organization will lose legitimacy, will lose funding, will lose accreditation or whatever, and ultimately fold up and go away. So legitimacy becomes this really big concept. Okay. Another big thing that they talk about is the rise of institutional isomorphism. The super jargony term basically means homogeneity. Essentially, all organizations within a field are expected to look, act the same way. So like all schools, all prisons, they all tend to look the same, at least in any given historical era. So like you go into a kindergarten classroom and they all kind of look the same. They have the alphabet, they have the chalkboard and all that. So this is institutional isomorphism. Or the phrasing that DiMaggio and Powell used when they introduced this concept, the striking similarity of organizations within a field. And they argue that this outcome of institutional isomorphism is caused by these strong pressures within the organizational field to conform to certain sets of expectations. And these pressures come from professionals, they come from funders and regulators. They come from a general uncertainty about like what should we do, like really what is the most efficient, the most effective, the right way to do things. And so these different sources of pressures within the field kind of help to shift everybody in the field to conform to this expectation, and then also kind of contribute to the construction of those organizations that don't conform as basically deviant or illegitimate, and then ultimately they go away. One of the kind of side processes of how this happens is also the creation of rational myths. These are generally inaccurate, or at least not evidentially motivated, or they have weak evidence to support them, claims about what's the most efficient way to do something. So a big one from my childhood was DARE, drug abuse resistance education. Just say no. Lots of money was spent on this, forcing 4th and 5th and 6th graders to take this course. And the idea was if you just give out this course, then kids won't do drugs. And lo and behold, turns out all the evidence that has evaluated this say that doesn't work, that was a complete waste of money, and yet in some cases they still do it. But I'm sure you can think of other examples where we have these rational myths where here's the right way to do things, and people believe it, and they spend money on it, and it turns out not so much. The other one from my childhood was fat-free diets, and now we know so much better. Okay, so this is kind of something we can see in a lot of different contexts. And again, most importantly, if you fail to adhere to these norms, this becomes a massive legitimacy problem for organizations, which can ultimately be fatal. Now, even as I'm saying this, hopefully you can already see the parallels to the idea of deviance and social norms. So basically what I want to do is take these concepts and apply them to essentially the individual level, still looking at the field, but basically we don't need organizations to use this theory. And so I want to see what happens when we put this theory into a different context and try to come up with a theory of deviance. Okay, so specifically the project that I'm going to talk about is my attempt to use new institutional theory to understand the social construction of norms, and the flip side of that, the designation of what constitutes deviance, specifically in rock climbing. So some steps that kind of I see as part of the new institutional kind of approach is you want to map out the field, figure out who the main actors are, you want to identify what the pressures are to conform, and you want to pay attention to those perceptions of what constitutes rationality, kind of see are those objective ideas or are they kind of socially constructed as well, and what role legitimacy plays in these processes. Okay, why rock climbing? It's just awesome. That's like the real reason, but it's actually a really, really good topic. So I'm hoping at some point to do a book on this. There are going to be like a bunch of different chapters kind of breaking off different chunks of this. I kind of want to make this caveat. There are a lot of moving parts. I'm just going to present a snippet of this. So some of the why rock climbing is not going to apply to the example I'm going to give today. But one that's going to be really important is this, the way in which rock climbing is actually a field with very strong internal norms. Like there are these very strong understandings of like, this is the right way to do things. And there's a lot of like disagreements about this. So on the one hand, they're strong, but at the same time, not everybody abides them, is always the case. So that's really useful. For the larger project, rock climbing is also a really useful case study because there's a lot of variation over time on like a lot of the different variables that you might be interested in. So things like thinking about rock climbing as originally this very deviant kind of marginal sport-ish to something that's basically gone mainstream. I'll talk more about that in just a moment. There are changing views about like what the rules of rock climbing are, the norms about how you should climb. That's changed over time. And then something I'm really interested in is the changing demographics. Basically, rock climbing in the 1950s was the domain of essentially white men. Now it's becoming more diversified. They're beginning in like the late 70s, 80s, you started to see a few more women. Now there are a lot more women involved. And then if you look beyond like professionals, rock climbing has become like this place for like the body positive movement and stuff. So like it's a really increasingly diversified setting. So in that sense, it's also really interesting. Okay, I said I would say a little bit more about rock climbing kind of moving from this like marginal thing that weirdos do to essentially mainstream. So these are just a couple of images I wanted to throw out as kind of giving you a sense of what I mean by marginal. So rock climbing, like in the 1950s, this is before the hippie movement, but it kind of anticipated a lot of the ideas of that like kind of hippie and like the original hipster stuff. So on the left we have the several rock climbing greats who had just climbed the mountain behind them, a particular route in less than a day. This is a 3,000-foot mountain, and this was like an epic accomplishment at the time, and it's still something that people kind of work on doing. But it just kind of gives you a sense of like, yeah, their outfits. And then some of the other ones, these are two pictures on the other side of Fred Beckey, who's kind of the ultimate dirtbag. There's now a movie about him called Dirtbag, The Legend of Fred Beckey. He's since passed. But the top one says absolutely no rock climbing. The one below will belay for food. And this kind of gives you a sense of this label of dirtbag that I used in the title. This is within the rock climbing community. It's seen as kind of like a badge of honor. This is like a thing that you embrace. But it also speaks to this kind of like quasi-hobo lifestyle. Now we have hashtag van life, and it's becoming, again, mainstream. But there's been this like long-standing idea of like not really having a permanent place to live, hitchhiking, camping out, scrapping by, essentially, and just living on the margins and kind of embracing that lifestyle, specifically so that people could climb as much as possible, and not having to have other distractions. Now, however, especially in the last year, but the last couple of years, and it's been an ongoing process, rock climbing is super mainstream. Like, I mean, to the point where you have like little kid birthday parties at rock climbing gyms. There are like multiple rock climbing gyms per city. I think we have at least 2 in Toronto. Every time I go to a conference, there's usually a rock climbing gym or 2 in whatever city. In addition, we've had, just in the last like 2 years, there have been mainstream movies with like massive releases. So Free Solo came out, The Dawn Wall came out. They're like both now available on iTunes. The Dawn Wall is about a late 2017 climb. 2 climbers climbed the mountain that I actually showed this one on the side. A really, really difficult route on this mountain. They were the first ones to use a particular technique to climb this mountain, and it took them like 17 days, and they finally did it. And so a movie was made about it. In addition, when they made it to the top, like there's a whole bunch of news coverage and stuff, and then President Obama tweeted at the 2 climbers, said, "So proud of you, Tommy Caldwell and Kevin Jorgensen, for conquering El Capitan. You remind us that anything is possible." So like the president is tweeting at these dudes that just climbed this mountain. Additionally, climbing is now going to be part of the Olympics. So there are now 3 types of climbing that have been, like, this was an ongoing battle to get it included, but it's now going to be included, so that's pretty interesting. Okay, so rock climbing is pretty much like normal now. Like, we, as we already saw, a bunch of people in the room are climbers. It's no longer this thing that's like for weirdos. So there's that. Okay, so in terms of what am I actually doing with this project, how am I studying deviance and norms within rock climbing? Basically, I'm just getting as much data as I possibly can. I'm essentially trying to be a historian with this project. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But in terms of my data sets, I'm looking at articles in a number of essentially now online, but even before they're online, magazines, mostly US based, but there's some Canadian and British climbing magazines as well. I'm also looking at a climbing forum called Super Topo, and they have like these discussions, kind of like Reddit, but for climbers. A number of climbing memoirs. So the picture on the upper right shows you some of the memoirs that I've been reading that kind of give you like a first-hand account of people's lives and what happened. Climbing documentaries, not just the 2 that I showed before, but also these like annual releases of short films of people doing different projects, trying to climb in different ways. That's the one on the series of images on the bottom right. In addition, some kind of like non-climbing specific text. So I've been looking at some New York Times articles, basically from the 1940s to the present, and then just miscellaneous web searches as I kind of identify specific things, and I go back and do web searches to get kind of more data. In terms of the kind of specific method I'm using, for everything that I look at, I'm trying to triangulate. So I'm trying to get multiple sources on any given kind of episode or thing that I find to kind of get different viewpoints. In general, I'm using content analysis and analytical memos. Essentially, I'm using the tools of ethnography, but applying them to kind of a historical and not exactly archival, because I'm not going to any archives, but in that sense, historical data, primary sources, and so on. And this kind of process of using the tools of ethnography, even though I'm not interviewing anybody, I'm not like going out and observing, I don't go to the climbing gyms to observe. So like that process of basically borrowing those tools is something that I've been developing as a technique to kind of help shore up some of the kind of problems with historical methods in a social science context. In general, what I'm looking for is basically any sort of statements and reactions about kind of norms or rules about climbing. So like when people say like, you know, somebody gave me pushback about this particular thing, or when people are discussing what the right way to climb is. But always I'm looking for discussions about the right way to climb or the right way to be a climber. And then beyond that, beyond these just general statements, I've been especially interested in kind of what I'm calling episodes, or this is kind of a version of something called the trouble case, or the case method, that goes back within the law and society field, the interdisciplinary study of law, looking at kind of cases of trouble and then studying those. And so this is kind of a technique that I'm borrowing from them. So I'm looking for these specific episodes where there's been some sort of like problem that people then step back and debate and kind of use that as a window into figuring out what the norms are and how people resolve any tensions about those norms. Okay. So my findings. So I want to kind of start off with, if this was a quantitative project, this would be like my descriptive statistics portion. So so one of the steps is just to kind of map out the field, like who are the actors involved. And I should mention that for my for these kind of field mappings, these are not supposed to be like super specific, because it's actually really hard to represent the field in these bubbles, but this tends to be how people represent fields. But just to kind of walk you through this, if you think of the big square as essentially the field, of like the climbing field, there are kind of these niches within each field, but they're also overlapping, which is kind of why that's so messy. So on the one hand, especially like today, and you could definitely do this over time and see like variations, but if you were to do a snapshot today, and kind of think of this as like the US climbing field, we have sport climbers, we have speed climbers, free soloists, boulders, trad climbers, aid climbers. And then kind of off to the side, like European climbers who also do a bunch of these other things, but I just wanted to like make clear that they're also in there. A lot of people like obviously travel to do climbing, so like people go to Morocco, people go to like parts of Canada, people go to Yosemite Valley in the US. So there's always some like international variation going on. Just to explain some of these terms, sport climbing is essentially going up a mountain or a wall, usually not like a very big route, usually like 30 to 150 feet, with fixed bolts, so it's considered like the safest approach to go in. You're roped in, you clip into these bolts, and you just go up, and it's a way to do like really hard climbing, but without kind of the possibility of like falling and ripping out your protection from the wall and like going splat. It's particularly popular, and it's one of the like the main methods that you do in a climbing gym. So there's that. Bouldering is something where basically you climb big boulders. Like I used to, my husband when he was first doing bouldering, or just imagine him like climbing to the top of like a 5 foot rock or something like that, and just like getting on top of a boulder. That's not what it is. Outside, it's basically you usually go up to about 30 feet on like a pretty big, you know, close to house size boulder, and you just climb up the rock, but you are not roped in. And then like in a gym context, this might be a wall of about 30 feet. Again, you're not roped in, you just climb up and then you kind of climb back down or jump down if you have no respect for your knees. Free soloing is the one that people oftentimes confuse with some of these other techniques. This is where you climb without ropes, so it's considered like the most objectively dangerous. Historically, people wouldn't climb big walls that way, but increasingly that's becoming a thing. Speed climbing is basically using any of these techniques, plus some others, and just getting up as quickly as you can. So sometimes kind of as a competition, sometimes just as a way to like test yourself. Trad climbing is basically just the opposite of sport climbing. You go up, but you put in your own bolts and stuff, so it can be a little bit more tricky, a little bit more dangerous, and so on. And then aid climbing is kind of like the old version where you have like these massive bolts and you kind of climb on these nylon ropes and stuff, and you do less climbing on the mountain itself, and you more kind of climb the tools that you bring with you, so it's a little different. Okay, so the point is there are these variations. It's okay if you don't remember what each of these are, just that there are different approaches. So this is kind of the field of like the main ways that people do climbing. If we were to kind of step back and go beyond the field of climbing and kind of bring in the outside world, there are a bunch of other groups that become important, especially for the study of norms. So if we have at the center climbers, and again, I want to remind you that these are a lot of times like not like the overlap. There's sometimes more overlap than is represented here. Okay, so you have climbers at the center. Then you have things like funders and sponsors. Increasingly professional climbers, especially like starting in the 80s, maybe the late 70s, started getting sponsored by like the North Face or Patagonia, Cliff Bar, and so on. So you have people basically giving money and gear to professional climbers. You have climbing advocacy organizations and nature organizations. In theory, these obviously could be separate, but a lot of times they're increasingly combined. Like the Access Fund is trying to protect climbing areas, and part of that also kind of includes environmentalism. Then you have regulators. So this might be like in the case of like national parks in the U.S., these might be park rangers. Sometimes it's just like regular authorities. So like in the state of Hawaii, at one point they prohibited or closed a bunch of cliffs and just said no more climbing. So basically some sort of governing authority that says like yes or no, you can do climbing, how you do it, do you need like a license, and so on. Then we get things like mainstream media, so like New York Times, Time Magazine, and so on. Or one example that actually won't come up, but Playgirl magazine, that actually became one of my data sets. Fans, of course. Then we have like the climbing media specifically, so like the magazines that I mentioned, like Outside, Climbing, All Climbing, Rock and Ice, and so on, and that completes the circle. So there are a lot of different kind of groups that are having their say and kind of influencing the norms of climbing, and are also responding to the kind of trends within climbing. Okay, going back to new institutional theory and kind of adapting that to this particular context. So basically, I'm taking these kind of the original theory of new institutional theory from institutional isomorphism, so these specific pressures. So the ones on the on this side for you, on the left side, these mimicry, normative, and coercion, those come specifically from new institutional theory. And to some extent, the rectangles that go with them are also from new institutional theory, but I'm just kind of tweaking the actors a little bit. So new institutional theorists, for example, say that funders and regulators are basically responsible for coercive power. They usually tell people, organizations, like, we'll give you money to do this thing, or if you want to be accredited, this is what you have to do. So this is pretty easy to adapt to climbing, because it's basically the same thing. We will give you money to do what we want you to do. So like, we will give you money to wear Patagonia gear or whatever, or we will give you money to like go and climb this particular wall or something that we think would be really cool. Authorities or regulators, we have the authority to make you do what we want you to do, or by extension not do. Professionals and experts in the new institutional context, this would be like professionals like academics, it could be professional associations, but basically the idea is these are people who have the training, the knowledge, the expertise to basically say what the right thing to do is, like what the most efficient, the most effective way, and so people listen to them because they want to do the most efficient thing. Okay. So again, kind of relatively easy to extend to the climbing context with some tweaks, probably not talking about like professional organizations and so on. And then finally, this is one that's kind of the interesting kind of tweak. With the new institutional theory, there's this understanding that basically when people are uncertain about the right way to do things, or organizations, I should say, they'll basically turn to the biggest, the most successful, but basically the kind of industry-leading organizations out there, and they'll just copy whatever they're doing. And the idea here is they're successful, they must know what they're doing, so we're just going to copy what they do. In this case, we can think of this as like the pro climbers, the most successful climbers. Okay. So in terms of the kind of specific things that I want to analyze, so the kind of to run through some of the episodes, I'm looking at instances where there's usually some sort of change. So it's either there's like the emergence of a new type of climbing style, or there's a major accomplishment that somebody has, or something really bad happens. These kind of create episodes. And in these episodes, we have these moments of significant debate where people kind of talk about what the expectations are about how you should behave, and like the pros and cons and so on. And sometimes out of these debates, we get new norms, and sometimes it just kind of solidifies old norms. I'm not going to talk about all of these, but just to give you some sense of like some of the types of episodes that I'm talking about. These are like ongoing debates or one-time debates, and also these are within the rock climbing field, but where outside groups might chime in. So the question of whether or not to use bolts, bouldering, is it real climbing? Sport versus trad, again, like is sport climbing real climbing, and so on. Free solo, climbing for the wrong reasons, taking sponsors, like is it good or bad? Speed records, should you go for it? Free base, which is a type of free solo where you have a like a base jumping suit on and can jump off, you can climb up without a rope, but then if you fall, you just bring out your parachute essentially. There are also some other episodes that I'm still kind of having a hard time categorizing them, but basically they have to do with environmentalism and colonialism, and so for the rest of this talk I'm not going to talk about them, but I do want to flag that they're in there and I'm still trying to figure out how to analyze them. Okay, so enough with the descriptive statistics, now the actual analyses. So I want to give you just two examples. So one is this question of to bolt or to not bolt. So this is a debate that happened in the 1950s, kind of ended by the 1970s, 1970-ish, but it basically features a debate between these two guys, Royal Robbins and Warren Harding, each of whom wrote a book. Royal Robbins wrote this kind of very serious book about how to do rock climbing, and then Warren Harding wrote kind of a farce called Downward Bound, a mad guide to rock climbing. So it kind of gives you a sense of their different approaches. In terms of specifics, what they were debating about, Royal Robbins was a proponent of kind of a pure way of climbing where you would basically leave the rock wall as intact as possible, or, and like not use a lot of bolts. So like this was very early when climbing was developing as a sport, and they would climb on these nylon rope things. So instead of climbing the features of the rock, they would basically like, essentially have rope ladders up. Like it was harder than that, but for simplicity, I'll just say that. Whereas Warren Harding started introducing, or was one of the people who introduced using these big pitons or bolts and like hammering them into the wall, which was very, took a lot of time, took a lot of effort, but it made your climbing a bit more secure because you had these big bolts that you basically couldn't remove, but they were also very damaging to the rock, and again, they couldn't be removed. So, so from a kind of aesthetic standpoint, this is really problematic. These two guys kind of went back and forth, kind of competing with one another, essentially to some extent for dominance, for some extent like for who's a better climber, and so they did a number of really epic kind of first descents or first climbs, but what essentially ended the debate was when Warren Harding climbed what was then called the Wall of the Early Morning Light, which is this one, this really sheer wall. Which is now called the Dawn Wall. It's an extremely kind of smooth rock face, so it's very difficult to climb. And so he climbed it with his bolt method. It took them like 27 days, but anyway, they finally did it. This was one of the climbs that, like, even back in the 1970s, or early 1970s, made it into the New York Times. So this was like a really big deal. Royal Robbins then tried to climb it again, and he was like every time Harding would do a climb, Robbins would go up and chop the bolts. So on this route, he tried to chop the bolts again, and got like a few pitches up, and decided, this is actually a really hard route and like also a very beautiful route, and just this feels wrong to do. And so he essentially let sleeping dogs lie, and there ended the debate between these two guys. And I think, from what I can tell, it seems like most people, like at the time there was some debate, but now it seems like more people are kind of on Harding's side, that it was like, yes, this moved the field forward. And he was able to do this like massively amazing climb. So there's that. The second example I want to talk about is free solo. So this has been the subject of a lot of debate, especially since the 1970s, maybe before, but definitely in the 1970s. And then it again kind of picked up in 2008 with the rise of Alex Honnold, who is the climber behind me. So again, free solo is the type of climbing that doesn't include ropes or harnesses. You just go out on the wall, you have your climbing shoes, you have a chalk bag, and you climb. So if you fall, obviously it could be very bad. So the episode I want to focus on here is the Cliff Bar debacle of 2014. So I think in 2013 or 2014, Sender Films released a really fun documentary called Valley Uprising about kind of the history of rock climbing in Yosemite Valley. And it featured a number of different climbers, kind of both the kind of original climbers and then some of the newer ones from the various generations. And it showed kind of what people were doing today, but in 2013, 2014. And so this involved things like free solo, free bass, and some other techniques. And it also showed them like dirtbagging around Yosemite and like running from the park rangers and stuff. Cliff Bar, who had been sponsoring a number of these climbers, decided they would withdraw their support and kind of ended their contract early with these 5 climbers. And it made a lot of news, again, kind of illustrating the way in which climbing has become mainstream. There are a bunch of articles from like NPR, the New York Times. Alex Honnold wrote a response that was published in the New York Times. This was covered by the climbing journals as well, so it kind of created a lot of debate. And then my favorite is this one where people pointed out that like basically the Cliff Bar logo doesn't show any ropes, and so it's kind of hypocritical of them to withdraw. Oh, and sorry, I didn't explain the reason Cliff Bar gave is that they decided that these people were doing the type of climbing they were doing was too dangerous and they didn't want to endorse it. Initially there was some pushback, and people were like, this is really awful, especially a lot of the fans were mad and kind of, again, pointing out the hypocrisy. There's, I don't have the original Twitter post because it's been taken down, but that picture is from a Twitter post where people were criticizing. But since then, a lot of the people kind of, the well-known figures for the most part have kind of seemed to not exactly side with Cliff Bar, but just kind of like not criticize them anymore. So that's been interesting. So again, kind of it's been mostly resolved. Okay, so in terms of kind of trying to map through these different types of debates that have come up, I came up with 3 categories that you can kind of sort the different sets of debates into. One of the biggest categories is just aesthetics, and we can kind of think of this as like a cognitive normative, to use the new institutional language, just kind of like what are the expectations, the kind of like almost implicit, like not really articulating it, but just this is the way to do it. A lot of times it gets described in terms of like purity or aesthetics. This is just like the most pleasing way to do things. Pretty much all of the debates that I'm talking about can go into the aesthetics category. But what's interesting is all of these can also be parceled out into 2 other categories. One is the risk category, and the other one is the efficacy category. So free solo, climbing for the wrong reasons, free base, and speed records are all often have debates about the riskiness of these endeavors. And then the bolts are not bouldering, sport versus trad, and taking sponsors oftentimes get discussed in terms of efficacy, like what do these things allow you to do. Both of these categories, the risk and the efficacy, you can think of as essentially like rational. Like they don't have to be objectively rational, but they're at least couched in this way of these are kind of like rational reasons. Whether or not it's correct that these are the most risky endeavors, that's actually up for debate, but if they are, they're at least perceived as like it's irrational to do this risky thing. Or it's rational to think about, at least in the new institutional sense, that this is an effective way to do things, so it's rational to do it this way. Okay. So this categorization is interesting because if you were to kind of map out these different, like what happens over the course of these debates, there's an interesting trend, and I'm really curious to see if this picks up. But so far, all of the debates that I've gone through kind of stick with this pattern. So if you start off with the top, you start off with some sort of claim that basically this is a bad thing to do, this is the wrong way to do climbing, this is the wrong way to be a climber. Either this goes into the rational considerations direction or the aesthetics direction. But what's interesting is all the aesthetics ones eventually get basically at the field level discussed as rational consideration. So like, if it's an aesthetic issue, like people can keep arguing that endlessly. So instead, they usually get resolved by these rational considerations. So think back to the Royal Robbins and Warren Harding debate. Like ultimately at the end of the day, it was, hey, bolts actually let you do some pretty epic climbs, so in that sense, we'll let it go. And then likewise with the Cliff Bar thing, it basically becomes this like issue of risk rather than like aesthetics, and that becomes the dominant consideration. Once you go from rational considerations, and it goes into the too risky or highly effective. Now, if you go back to who are the groups that are making these determinations, so the kind of rectangle that's on my screen purple, but here it's kind of a grayish color, that's kind of like just the general field as the background. But then you have this one is the kind of pinkish one is like the funders. They tend to be more interested in this risky stuff. And then in terms of the successful climbers, they tend to be the ones determining the highly effective. So if you look at like which types of arguments are brought up by which groups, it tends to be parceled out in this direction. And then I didn't mention this one. This one in the background is supposed to be just like general climbers. So general climbers as opposed to like professional climbers, but like they think about both the rational considerations and the aesthetic considerations. But in terms of once you break it down between the rational considerations and the efficacy ones, the funders are pretty much on the risk side, and then the successful climbers kind of break out the highly effective stuff. Okay, so to kind of wrap things up, so I think we can apply new institutional theory to other settings beyond organizational settings and kind of get some headway on the deviance understanding. There's definitely some limits to this. So for example, this doesn't explain all views about norms. So I'm really looking at a certain type of discussions about norms. Those that are at the field level, they're visible. I'm not able to go into like hidden pockets of like, you go to a random crag and ask like what, people just going out and climbing think about these things. I'm really looking at these discussions at the field level, so that can, possibly have some implications. I'm also looking at debates within the climbing field, but not like this model doesn't help us to explain how climbing went from this marginal sport to a fairly mainstream thing, where it went from like basically being this deviant thing, also like weightlifting, for example, it used to be super deviant, now it's super mainstream. This doesn't help us to explain that part of that deviance model. Okay. It will be interesting to see if this holds up for other fields, like like risk is something that you see in other places, but maybe there are other types of rational considerations. Is it the case that aesthetic considerations often give way to the rational considerations? And then ultimately, I'm not yet convinced about this, but maybe neo-institutional theory can help us to revive deviant studies and make it into something else. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.